Hi, and welcome to GitHub Actions DevOps Pipelines as Code using C# and Cake SDK. Today we're going to talk about how you can improve your DevOps feedback loop, reuse patterns have a consistent experience with low ceremony, and essentially just a more joyful experience. Hello, my name is Mattias Karlsson. I'm a partner and senior architect at Virkon AB, a consulting company in Gothenburg, Sweden. I'm also a Microsoft.NET and DevOps Developer Technologies MVP. I'm an open source citizen and maintainer of several projects. And also, I'm a husband of one and father of two. So let's talk about GitHub Actions experience today. GitHub Actions is a great improvement from how it used to be. Now you have something that's more maintainable. You have your YAML file that you commit to source code, it's versioned, it's all. And it's easier to reuse, but you can have actions, you can have the same pipeline shared more easily between repositories. But it's not very discoverable. And it's a high barrier to entry. And the workflow usually is something like this. You edit this YAML text file, you save it, you commit and push, and then you wait. And then you grab some coffee and wait some more, and then something happens and you have to rinse and repeat. How's the Cake workflow? Well, with Cake, we have more experience that looks like this. I think it's more discoverable because you have a strongly typed language, you have IntelliSense, and all the systems of that. It's more reusable because you can share with things like NuGet packages that you already have, and you have things like, I think, more maintainable. And how does the workflow look with the Cake? Well, you still edit the text file, in this case, a C# file. You save it, and here's the big difference. You can run it and test it and compile it locally first. So you can see that there's no syntax errors, you have the power of a strongly typed language, and you know that the flow works. You can test everything locally first. Then you still commit and push it, you wait, you grab some coffee, and rinse and repeat. So what is Cake? Cake's a cross-platform. So it works both on Mac, Linux, Windows, and FreeBSD, and so on. It's cross-environment. It will work both on your local machine, on your server, on your container, your build service, etc. It's cross-service. So it will work across many, like both GitHub Actions, GitLabs, TeamCity, Azure Pipelines, and so on. It's open source, so it's open for everyone to see, contribute, and work with. And also, it's a build orchestration framework. So what's a build orchestration framework? It's something that can make easier to have complex build and release workflows. It has tools integrations, IO abstractions, and APIs. It has built-in integrations for working with CI/CD services. It makes it easy to automate repetitive tasks, and it makes it easy to have reusable patterns and logic. And foremost is a C# code-based language. So you have a strongly typed language that you work with. The language you already know if you're using .NET. So the history of Cake. Well, Cake isn't new. Cake was initially released in 2014, and then it was an exe that ran on a .NET framework, and it was a C# scripting DSL. In 2015, we went cross-platform and added mono support, still a C# scripting DSL. Then in 2016, we went even more cross-platform. We added support for .NET Core 1.0. And in 2018, when .NET SDK supported tools, we made it easier to air quite quick. We introduced the Cake tool, but also Cake Frosting, which was an ASP.NET Core-like build experience. So we had both the C# DSL and a console. Now in 2015, we're also launching the Cake SDK, which is what I'm going to talk about today. It's something like bringing the mix of the flexibility, like the simplicity of the C# DSL, but into a top-level statement console application, where we will do all the code generation, everything we did before, but in a .NET SDK. So how does a regular .NET application work? Well, when we had a workflow for that, we will restore, so fetch our dependencies from some NuGet feed or things like that. We will then build our code. Hopefully, we'll also test our code. And after that, we will package our code to like a NuGet package for a library or a zip file for a website. And then we will publish that artifact to either like a registry or to a pipeline artifact. So for this, we will use presentation. We'll use a sample solution that looks fairly common for .NET developers. We will have a solution file. We will have a class library. We'll have a unit test project and a console application. So how do we get started with Cake SDK? For that, we make it simple to either you can just use a template we created, so you can install it from NuGet using .NET new install Cake template, and that will fetch the template and install it so you can from NuGet. Then we have several templates you can use. We have the minimal, which is just like a hello world. We have a more complex file, and we also have a full C# project template. And we will add more as we go along. But you can also just, if you have a simple C# file, you can just add the SDK directive, and it will fetch Cake from NuGet, and you can add, then you can just go on the rock as you do with scripting experience from a console application. You can also use a regular C# file by just adding the SDK directive, and just like you would do a testing project or a .NET project, it's just a regular .NET SDK. So let's start with Hello World in Cake. So let's automate the build of our sample project using Cake. We can see here that I have our class library, our unit test, our console application, and solution. We start by adding a C# file which will contain our build definition. So let's create that. We can call it cake.cs. And the first thing we need to do is to reference the Cake SDK. In a single file application, we do that using the SDK preprocessor directive. So SDK and do the cake.sdk. And just to try that, see that things work, we can just do like print hello world. So hello world. And so if we look at console, let's do .NET cake.cs. And this is using the .NET 10 single file application, and it will download the SDK, it will execute and compile the code and create a C# project in the background. So we can see now that everything works. So let's start with our build definition. So to orchestrate build definition and the flow of that, Cake has a notion of thing called tasks. So tasks can have dependencies, can have criteria, can have things, so you know which order things are executing and when they execute. And the first thing we want to do here is to do a restore of our dependencies. So let's start with a restore task. So restore, and it should do a .NET restore. So let's do that. Restore. You can see what we have nice intelligence here. So restored the solution in the source folder, and after we restore, we want to build. So let's do a build. And here Cake has notion of dependencies, so you can do that the build is dependent on the restore. And then we should do a .NET build, so it does .NET build. And after we build, and we want to test our code, so let's add a test task. And it should happen first after we build. So it's dependent on build. And it does .NET test. We can tag like this. And after we test, then we want to create a NuGet packages. So let's create a pack task. It's dependent on our tests execute successfully. So dotnet bank. So to execute a task, Cake has an alias called run target. And Cake has built-in command line parsing support. So let's do an argument. So let's say we have a target argument. And by default, we want to run, if nothing specified, we want to run the unit test. So let's try this. So let's do .NET Cake CS. Now we can see that it actually does a restore. After it does a restore, it does a build and then a test. And if we want to also do a pack, then we need to specify target. So let's try that. So do target. And now we can see that it does a restore, it does a build, it does the test, and then it will create our NuGet package. So what if we want to control where our NuGet packages end up, which is kind of nice to know where they end up. Then we can see something rated like all tools that Cake wrap are strongly typed. So we can have something like a new .NET pack settings, which will have an output directory. And we want to put it in the artifacts folder. Well, then do artifacts. And if we now execute with a pack target, we should see the same flow, but hopefully after it's restored, built, test, and packed, we should see that it ends up in an artifacts folder. So if we go back to our solution, we can now see that our NuGet packages from our class library and from our console application end up in an artifacts folder. Now, if we're running on GitHub Actions, we want to store these artifacts. For example, upload them to the pipeline. So let's start with an upload artifact task. Upload artifact. And this we only want to run if it's running under GitHub Actions. So here the task have a notion of criteria. So with criteria, and Cake has a built-in GitHub Actions provider, so we can do GitHub Actions is running on GitHub Actions. This means that the task will only be executed if it's running on GitHub Actions. And what should it do? Well, we want it to upload artifacts. And here the GitHub Actions provider has a command called upload artifact. And the upload artifact can take either a directory you upload or a file. In this case, it's a directory, so we'll type directory will be artifacts. So we have a known location, and we need to name the artifact, so let's call it NuGet. And like this. Now, in future, we want to be able to have a stable endpoint. We want to change the YAML for this. So we want to have the same target regardless of what we have done in our definition for GitHub Actions. So Cake has a notion that you can create a task with only dependencies, and in this case, we want to create a GitHub Actions task. So GitHub Actions, and it's dependent on on the upload artifact. Yes, and also here we need to fix that. Well, we can't upload artifacts if we haven't done a pack, so it should be dependent on pack. So like this. So what happens if we execute the new GitHub Actions target? So now we can see that it still does a restore, it does a build, it does a test, it then hopefully does a pack, and then it skips the upload artifact because it's not running on the GitHub Actions. But we can still test the flow. We can see that the C# is valid, it's strongly typed, it's compiled, and we have strong confidence that a flow should work. So now we need to bootstrap our cake with the YAML, and as I don't want to type any YAML, I have prepared, so I'll just let's done. So if you look in the solution, the GitHub Actions workflows are in your GitHub workflows, and then a YAML file. And what this does is essentially defines the environment once, and we should never need to touch this unless we change the environment. So this defines that the flow will be triggered if we push to the branch develop or main or a pull request. We can then see that it will run on an agent for the latest. It will then fetch the source code. It will install the .NET SDK that we have in our proper JSON, and it will then execute our Cake CS with the GitHub Actions target. So this will be almost set in stone unless we change our environment. We'll build from now on, enter our build definition in our Cake CS file. So on GitHub Actions, we have our sample project before we have either Cake CS or our build definition. So let's see if we can get this to work. So if we check what we have done, we have a new file with a YAML, and we have our Cake CS created. So let's commit those. And this means we have a commit with our new YAML and our Cake build definition. So let's push this. Go over to GitHub, refresh. We can see now that we get a workflow. We now have an action, and we can follow it and see that it installs the .NET SDK. After it installs the .NET SDK, it runs our Cake build definition, and we can see here that it does exactly the same thing as it did locally. It will do the .NET restore. After it restores, it will do the build. After build, it will run the unit tests, and after the unit tests, it will create a NuGet packages. And here we can see that it uploads the artifacts. It wasn't skipped because it was running on the GitHub Actions. And if we look at the summary, we can see that we have now an artifact called NuGet. And if we download that, we can see that we have our NuGet packages that were created in our DevOps pipeline. So that's really sweet. We have a full pipeline, edit, and Cake. So now we showed you how we can work with Cake, and how does it compare to YAML? Well, it's fairly simple in one way. In YAML, where we're going to restore, we're going to do a dotnet restore. And in Cake, well, we do a dotnet restore. If you look at build, you will do a dotnet restore, well, not a build, I mean, and in Cake, we'll do a dotnet build. And similar for if you're going to test, you can do dotnet test, and in Cake, we'll use dotnet test. And if you're going to do create a NuGet package, you can do a script talk that's the dotnet pack, and then output to an artifacts folder. And here we can see similar in Cake where we do a dotnet pack, and we can do a settings class with strongly type path for the output directory. And something like if we're going to publish to GitHub, like in GitHub artifact, we'll use something in YAML that would upload artifact and the path to the artifacts. And similar, Cake has built-in commands where you can either upload a file or a folder using the GitHub Actions command upload artifact. So this means that with Cake, we can reduce our YAML to essentially only something like this. Well, not fully stuff like this, but YAML will become more describing the environment you're in. So a full YAML will look something like this, where you have, well, what's going to trigger? In this case, we will trigger either on the development branch or main branch, or if there's a pull request, we will run on this agent, in this case, Ubuntu latest, that could be your self-hosted. We will check out the code, and we will install the .NET SDK, and then the rest of the flow is handled by Cake. So your YAML, it just describes the environment, and the rest will live on in your Cake script file. And this will not change. Essentially, you don't need to touch the YAML unless something in your environment changes. So let's talk about extensibility. Cake has a lot of batteries included, like a lot of features that you need for a build process included, but it also had a lot of they can fetch extensions. So we have something called add-ins, which will bring new functionality to Cakes, like new build services or talking to, I want to send a message to Slack or each of them when the build succeeds, or Teams or something like that. So that adds features to Cake. We also have modules, which are essentially also NuGet packages, which can change internals of Cake. So you can have things like the file system or logging or things that can be changed. And we also have tools you can fetch from NuGet, like I want Git version or some other tool that can also extend your Cake build process. And also any NuGet packages. So essentially, if I want to parse YAML, well, just bring in YAML.net as you would do in any regular .NET application. So in .NET 10, to be able to sort this single file projectless applications, they've added a couple of pre-process directives, which can be good to know. So they added things like SDK, property, package, project, and shebang. What does that mean? SDK is the way to reference an SDK in your single C# file. And it can either be without a version, which means that it will version from your global JSON or your .NET SDK. Or you can be with a version, and then you can have different versions for different files. Then you pin the version like this. The property is to set MS build properties, because it's just a C# project file in behind for even for a single file application, which means that you can have a property group and set things like, well, I want the language preview that will look something like this when you set the key and the value. And that is just like in a property group when lang versions preview, it's the same similar. And package is the way to fetch external packages from a NuGet feed. So that looks something like this. Like if I want to just fetch a NuGet package, I will just do package, the package ID, and at the version. So in this case, NuGet, I want to fetch the Newtons of JSON version 38v, or if I want to fetch the Cake Slack add-in, something like this, or I want to fetch the Cake build system module, that will look something like this. The Unix shebang is something that only works on Unix systems, something like Mac or Linux or FreeBSD or similar. And that gives the opportunity to essentially lead your software that so you can create that your C# file is an executable. And that makes you can just execute your C# without adding .NET prefix or just execute it. So that was what I had to talk about today. Hope you enjoyed it. Here are links to the example project, the presentation. You can find all information about Cake on cakebuild.net, and you can find me as dev lead on most scenarios. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed.